Hey class, how are you doing? Today we're going to be going over Chapter 11, Mexican Americans and their experiences within the community and migrations from Mexico to the United States, and some local history with Los Angeles, the Zoot riots, and everything in between. This is going to be a look at the turn of the century, at the turn of the early 1900s, leading up to around the World War II era. And then later on in a couple of chapters, for chapter 13, I believe, the Latino Mosaic, we're going to be looking at World War II up until more of the present day. And that section and chapter are going to be detailing, things such as Cesar Chavez and a lot of the civil rights movements. But for today, it's going to be kind of the early on history a little more. So sit back, relax, and I hope you enjoy. So the book starts out with this wonderful, story. And it starts terribly, but it has a good ending. So this was the Sleepy Lagoon murder. This is where Los Angeles newspapers tried to describe the death of a young gentleman, Jose Diaz, who was discovered unconscious and dying on the side of a road in California. And so shortly after that, three of the young men were charged with murder and convicted of first degree. 9 others were convicted of second-degree murder and 5 of assault. So essentially, they were trying to find the culprits of whoever was, throwing this kid in a ditch, right, a swimming hole, and just left him for dead. And so after 20 months, a federal appeal court reversed the ruling, right? So after all these kids were just straight up just sentenced to prison, a federal appeals court reversed the ruling, stating that the judge in the lower court had been biased and that there was no evidence linking them to the crime. And so this was a iconic, victory for the early Latino civil rights movements. And so this, has a discussion on two fronts. First, that, Mexican Americans at this time were having a really difficult, time in the United States and California, as racism started to proliferate once again. And kind of all of these animosities, right? We are in the World War II era, right, for this particular section and snippet and story. And so we'll get to why this particular story was important, and how that fits into the later Zoot riots. But as far as, the ending of the story, thankfully the judicial system finally went in and remedied some of the injustices for this, right? And so just because a judge or anyone else has some type of prejudice against a group of individuals or people, that does not mean that should affect their livelihoods or case in any way, shape, or form. But in a general sense, for Mexican Americans in general at this time, right, in the late 1800s, turning towards the century, we will be going over and covering lightly the U.S.-Mexican-American War, and how the United States ended up acquiring over 1 million square miles, right, of land, gaining all of these tens of thousands of new citizens, paying a handsome fee, but not anything too egregious, for the land, and in general how all of these folks who are living in all of these states and territories west of Texas, that was encompassing of Mexico, right? Before the United States had the war and sort of started to gobble them up and annex them. All of these individuals that were living here already, a number of them stayed. So the agreement was, after the Mexican-American War transpired, the United States ended up getting a hold of all of those various territories, as we have spoken before in our Manifest Destiny sections. And so part of the agreements there was all of the Mexicans living within those states had an option: either move down to Mexico and live there permanently and still be Mexican citizens, or stay where they are and be incorporated into Americans. And so for the most part, the majority of them stayed where they were and ended up becoming American citizens. But those individuals had a very interesting time. So imagine that you and your family and your generations were living here already, right? And then suddenly the territory is being conquered right, by these white English-speaking Protestant society. And so somehow within your own territory and land, you have to make this, very abrupt change and shift in your perspective, right? And so how these folks navigated through this time, it was, very interesting to say the least. And so here's a slightly lower quality photo that I was able to find of the Sleepy Lagoon trial. And so all of these young men were part of the trial of supposedly being involved in this killing. But eventually, the judicial system, alongside of their lawyers and advocates, started to fight for their rights and eventually got it. So when in doubt, hire a lawyer, right? Or make friends with a bunch of attorneys or lawyers if you can throughout your life. And here's a little kind of recap of the Mexican-American War, just in case some of you forgot some of our Manifest Destiny sections. And so this is a nice recap of kind of why the war started, what were the after effects, and what territory swapped from both sides. But once territory did swap from both sides, and we started getting all of these various new states transferred toward American hands, such as California, New Mexico, Texas, Arizona, right? All of those lands. California ended up being the crown jewel of them all due to the gold rush. And so people knew that early on, that they wanted California for its wealth and riches. And so, within California at the time, we did have, a various structure, right, left from the Mexican government, which is a subset of the old kind of Spanish rule, right? And so that kind of mentality, a very European-esque governmental mentality and a social hierarchical mentality, indicated that you have your various class, right, that you are born into. And so it is determined by blood and, the percentage of European to native blood and all of that in between. So at the very high end of the hierarchy would be the Mexican elite, the Californios. They were more of the aristocracy, having the best positions in government, the best lands, right? The very wealthy ranches and vineyards and stuff like that. In the middle, right, sort of the middle class, if you will, were the mestizos. So there were the artisans, the soldiers, the vaqueros, the small farmers, right, the businessmen, like anyone in the middle who had some type of mixed race blood in them. And at the very bottom were the over 100,000 Californian Native Americans, right? They were kind of seen as the lower end of the totem pole. And so once the California gold rush, right, in 1849, just a year later, was discovered, right, everyone just completely lost their minds. And so, this event alone, just from the gold rush, raised the white population within California by an immediate 80+ thousand. Not even to mention all the other immigrants coming over from, let's say, China, Southeast Asia, anybody else trying to strike it rich in California, kind of pining and mining for gold. And so we start to get, right, from a very kind of governmental level, right, various legislation changes which are going to benefit certain groups and are going to disadvantage other groups, such as the Land Act of 1851. So this was an attempt to solve or resolve somehow confusing land titles for all of these new folks coming in. However, whites were controlling the board, and all of the proceedings were specifically only in English, no interpreters of any kind. And so Mexicans did not fare too well in this because they consistently had all of these kind of challenges and hurdles throughout the bureaucratic system that they had to employ. And on top of that, if they wanted to appeal, right, and just say to the, just say the lower court is obviously not doing justice for me, the appeal process was expensive. So they really tried to put as many barriers in front of the individuals as possible. One such perfect example was Salvador Vallejo. He was a very wealthy rancher in Napa and spent a decade and nearly $100,000 to protect his lands and titles. In the end, he lost most of his wealth due to just spending it on the courts and lawyers and whatnot. And then armed squatters eventually killed his livestock, burned his crops, and forced him to sell his land. So even at the very top end, right, if you were a wealthy individual, a rancher, right, a businessman, someone part of the Mexican elites, right, the Californios, even they would end up trying to force your hand. And so here's Mr. Vallejo, right, one of the aristocrats, arguably in his own right, very wealthy, very comfortable, but even him and all of his money and connections could not stop the various individuals who were running these boards to stop harassing him and his lands and titles. And so California was this period of time where, because of the gold rush and the various money that could have been made, the folks were, being kind of squatted off their land, right, so to speak. And so ethnic relations in California was a bit, strenuous, right, to say the least. New Mexico, things were actually pretty peaceful in New Mexico. And so, the New Mexicans, as they called them, the Nuevos Mexicanos, were welcoming all these incoming American soldiers, right, after the war, and starting a new life. So society here was revolving primarily around wealthy businessmen, landowners, and some ranchers here and there. But as American soldiers started to come over more and more, these folks and the New Mexicans decided to define themselves as Spanish Americans. And so we have more reports in New Mexico of people, instead of saying I am Mexican or Mexican American, I am Spanish American. Because that had a connotation of, oh, well, you have more European blood in you, right? Which means you are not part of the sort of mestizo category, right? You're more European and Spaniard. And so that was giving them a little higher of a leg up. However, this tactic, I do have to say, historically speaking, is only pretty successful if the individual was fortunate enough to be born light skinned. And so they were sort of the chameleons that were going through both societies at the time, and we have reports of that. And Latino culture was, prevailing in New Mexico for decades, and it held a very strong belief. And so we had, them trying to protect their culture, their language, and heritage over time. And they had some political reasons for, doing so. Because New Mexico, unlike California, did not have this cataclysmic, event like the gold rush to just force, right, tens of thousands of new migrants into their state. Number one, the topography of New Mexico is pretty dry and deserty, right, and arid. And so naturally, folks are not, really kind of looking at this territory and saying, oh, dear God, right, I want to, settle here. And so they did not have those vast mineral deposits like California had. So that wasn't really attracting anyone. And on top of the topography, it was just New Mexico, right? It was just there. So they did have a much more successful time at kind of just distancing themselves as much as possible. However, trouble did start to brew eventually, because starting in the 1870s and progressing especially into the 80s and 90s, we started getting various railroad systems being built throughout New Mexico. And so initially, this would seem like a great idea, right? Because it connects you to the national market with mining and cattle and cotton and timber and whatever else. However, as a lot of the mines started to expand in New Mexico, right, and more mineral wealth here and there is being discovered, a lot of those rich ranchers that we were talked about started to see that their lands were being eyed and surveyed a little more carefully. And so they were being offered more money to get bought out and eventually just to move. And so that in and itself started to lead to more migration waves. And so as these migration waves continued, we start to see an influx of more white bankers, merchants, lawyers, right, coming on in. And as soon as they start coming in, they need to make friends and allies with the locals. And so they find the top 20 or so wealthy Nuevo Mexicano families, right, the very wealthy landowners and ranchers, and a few who had some mines and etc., and start to essentially have, an under-the-table deal so that they can control or heavily influence the legislature and the courts. And so essentially, this is a story of the 20 wealthiest Nuevo Mexicano families selling out the rest of the New Mexicans. And so they started to charge the New Mexicans high interest rates, and essentially give bankers their pick on defaults and foreclosing on land. They created a board of land commissioners. And this board was absolutely evil because they started to shift the burden of proof on New Mexican owners during these land title disputes. So for instance, if the bank comes over to your ranch and your land that you've had for like a few generations, and they say, oh, where's your paperwork? If you don't have paperwork, we are going to confiscate your land for the state. The burden is now placed onto you to provide any type of legal paperwork. And land titles were pretty difficult to prove in New Mexico for the few reasons. A couple centuries beforehand, the Pueblo uprising that they had is like a local Native American uprising, destroyed a lot of the early land grants by Spain. So any old Spanish documents with the official royal seal on it, right, that they would have to say these are your land titles and such, a lot of that was burned down. After the Mexican-American War finished, Mexico essentially told their soldiers, go to all the governmental buildings and capture as much as you can and bring it back, right? Documents, wealth, whatever. So a lot of the soldiers carried off a lot of these deeds as well, just to have it for their records. And then later in 1892, one of the main state archive buildings in New Mexico actually ended up burning down for whatever other rest of the documents they had. And so from all of these, the Board of Land Commissioners, from the approximate 301 cases from this period of time that they were looking at, only 75 were allowed to retain their land. So as you can tell, just from a pure numbers game, most of them start to lose their land and start to get forcibly kind of kicked out. And so this is a consistent type of situation, right, that New Mexicans found themselves in. And then the third states that we're going to look at, so we're going over California, New Mexico, and Texas is going to be the third one in our kind of comparative analysis. Texaco was a lot more violent. Again, violence was at the center of Texas history and relations. We had the Texas independence with the Alamo. We had the Mexican-American War. Violence was proliferating for around 10 years or so. And then after the violence started to decrease a bit, right, and Texas had its independence, got incorporated into the United States of America eventually, we start to see a difference and differentiation between Texans and Tejanos. And so Texans were Southern Protestants, but were very prejudiced against the colored folk, right, as they would call them. And then the Tejanos were, they were local Mexican-American populations, right? So by 1840, the Texans outnumbered the Tejanos 10-1. By 1850, they outnumbered them 16-1. So you could imagine, as the years and decades are going on, how this trend and shift in population is continuing. And so, unlike California and New Mexico, though, once they started to try to push them off their land, right, and say, where are your land titles? Surprisingly enough, the Spanish government, in relation to Texas, they had pretty well-defined deeds. And so many Tejanos actually got reprieve for their lands and actually were able to keep their lands because they had a lot of the good documentation left over. And so as far as Texas goes, they got a nice lucky break. But because they couldn't kick them off the land, now what they ended up doing was increasing taxation for them, following the rise of industrialization prices and commodities and such things. And so many of these Tejanos started to see increased taxes and property taxes, land taxes, and so they started to default and foreclose because of that. So when something doesn't work, the loopholes, start opening up apparently. And what they started to do with a lot of Tejanos was they would come up to you and your land and your farms and say essentially, hey, listen, I'll buy you out, but I'll give you a fraction of what your land is worth, let's say half or a third or a fourth. And a lot of times folks would actually say yes to that because they knew that if they would take it to court, the courts would pretty much bankrupts them, right? Because they didn't have the money to just keep fighting legal battles back and forth. And so it seems to me that in the past 100+ years, nothing has really changed in terms of law. The lawyers want all your money. And so by 1900, by the turn of the century, right, from kind of viewing all of these different perspectives of different states and experiences, we started to see that Mexican Americans almost became a colonial people due to unfair white-dominated politics that we have recorded. And this goes back to our Manifest Destiny section, but at the very end of the Mexican-American War, they signed the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which stipulated that the Rio Grande River is going to be the border between the U.S. and Mexico. It stipulated that all those extra states and territories would be now incorporated into the United States. The people that would be left over can choose whether they want to be American or move south and become Mexican again. But there was a fairness clause in the treaty, and the fairness clause said that you must treat the citizens fairly during this transition, and that was nowhere to be found. And so as we start to move into the 1900s, these kind of stories of, let's say, land boards, right, coming up with all this legal action that are bankrupting families, due to this, we eventually get this wonderful organization called the League of United Latin American Citizens, or LULAC for short. And so this was to become what the NAACP will become for African Americans as well. The right strong arm of legality and justice for the Latino community. And so this would be their, sort of their judicial fight against racism and discrimination. And so the middle class of Mexican Americans started to focus on civil rights. They started to focus on legal methods of pushbacks, right, against this seemingly unstoppable wave of white migration, right? And so LULAC itself started to essentially fight legal battles in court, but also advocate for higher education as, quote unquote, the way out of the barrio, and overall calling for an end to discrimination. So what they would do is, and they still do this today, LULAC is alive and well. They would fight any high-tier civil rights cases, protect you legally and tell you what your rights are. But on top of that, they would always keep telling you and your children, go to school, get an education. That is how we are going to beat the system. And there's a video that I'm going to show soon. But even in the video, it details LULAC, and even today, they are giving millions of dollars of scholarships, right, to young students so that they could start and progress their educational careers. And in addition to that, since we had LULAC fighting the legality system, by 1930, the United States had created a distinct class, right? A distinct U.S. Census checkmark, right? And so while many American unions were also lobbying to restrict Mexican immigration because they did not want to compete with them in the job market, Mexico was being exempted from the National Origins Act because of heavy lobbying. So 1924 and onward saw this National Origins Act, which I think I brought up on a couple of different occasions through our previous lectures. But essentially, the United States was having such high demand of and high flow of immigrants that they essentially were trying to cap off the limit, how many people can come from every country, right, to kind of slow down migration a little bit. And so because LULAC was lobbying so hard, Mexican Americans were exempted from this. This is a wonderful video. It's approximately, I think, 10 minutes long. And so this is the history of LULAC and what they've done, how they've been, instrumental in the civil rights cases and eras in the last few decades, and up to today, what they do in terms of giving scholarships, education, and giving a first-hand account of this individual who got a scholarship, went to school, and now works as an engineer and works with NASA. This is a little bit of a longer one. If anyone has, I believe this was like 40 minutes, 45 minutes long, but this is part of a multi-part series of the Latino American experience. And so part 2 over here is the years that we're talking about, sort of the mid-1800s up to the World War II era. So if any of you are really interested, definitely pause the lecture, go watch this, and then come back. It goes much more in depth into a lot of the experiences, not just for Mexican Americans, but Latinos in general, right? And it's pretty interesting. Let us talk about revolution. So, in Mexico, during the early 1900s, Mexico had a series of upheavals, right, and revolutions and civil wars and such. Mexican history is so fascinating. You could literally have an entire, couple of classes just dedicated to Mexican history, right? It is so fascinating and turbulent. And so if anyone ever has the time, please take a class on it. The more and more I'm, jumping into it, the more I want to learn. In 1911, they had a major revolution. It was an armed struggle lasting, almost a decade that was transforming Mexican culture and government. And so it began when their president, Porfirio Diaz, failed to provide a stable line of succession and who the next president would be. And so a crisis began, which emerged into the Mexican Civil War. And so for that decade, from like 1910, 1911, all the way to 1920, we start seeing counter-revolutionary regimes funded by the U.S. and business interests wanting to retain the old regime for stability. So essentially, we have the new revolutionaries coming up, trying to establish change. The United States is directly funding the old regime so that everything would be stable. American businesses would continue to operate as normal. And so the fight in this entire Civil War was between two individuals, mainly. General Victoriano Huerta, who was backed by the United States and was sort of the old guard of stability, and the revolutionary leader, Emiliano Zapata. This guy is amazing, and we're going to discuss why. We were going to discuss his life in a bit more detail right now, but at the very end of it, at the very end of the Civil War, Zapata was eventually assassinated by the president's forces, leading to more armed struggle until it finally had to end in 1920. Estimates indicate around 1.5 million, folks died from the Civil War, and around 250,000 were fleeing. And so this explains, an enormous part of, these departures, right, in the early 20th century. Because all of our other lectures, we've discussed various parts of the world, right? There's some catalyst that forces you and your family to leave your homeland and move all the way to another, country, in this case, the United States. Whether it's famine, war, anything else. In this case, it's war. And so we start to get a number of people crossing the border into California, New Mexico, Texas, all these territories in order for more peace and stability. And so General Victoriano Huerta, he was a dictator in almost all senses, whose regime united revolutionary forces in common opposed to him. So because he was such a hard-fisted ruler, all these revolutionary forces gathered to oppose him. He was a very corrupt individual, and he arrested the previous president, Francisco Madero. So essentially, Madero was dethroned. This was almost like a coup d'etat. And so the revolutionary forces did not appreciate this, right, in the slightest, and wanted to overthrow him because he essentially just took power for himself. And so this is very kind of old guard, the old Mexican government, Spanish imperial influence, right, kind of the old ways of doing things. And the Americans are funding them because they want peace and stability in the region. And so they are planning for the counterinsurgency. They're planning to shut down the revolution in whatever fashion they can, and go up against the new revolutionaries who are fighting for the people in the form of General Emiliano Zapata. This man was extraordinary. So he was a revolutionary, and because the majority of the population at this time were in some type of agricultural industry, he was championing the agrarian individual and the family, right? Championing for the little guy, right? For the every man, and he was fighting in guerrilla warfare style. For those of you who do not know what guerrilla warfare is, and it is not war between legions of guerrillas. So essentially, if you have big armies, right, in kind of a military style fashion, two armies will kind of clash, right, on the battlefield, fight, and then whoever is the victor wins, and whoever's the loser, right, either runs away or gets captured. Guerrilla warfare is, that you do not have the numbers or strength to fight the enemy on an open battlefield, so you pick your engagements very strategically. You hit and run. You hit and run. So you inflict as much damage as possible, and then by the time they can turn around and fire at you, you run away. And so, he started to really rebel against them for this entire decade. But more importantly than that, he became a symbol for the people. He became a symbol to unite the revolution around. And he was he turned himself into a very unique, charismatic sort of poster child and status. He had his very iconic mustache. As you see on the right hand side, he had his very famous get up. He had his bandolier wrapped around him, right? This kind of pocketed belt of ammunition slung over the shoulder, right? Sort of like a Red Dead Redemption style bandolier. And he became an icon, right, for people. He became an icon so much that folks started to copy him, right, and have the bandoliers around them as well, and wear the hat just like he would. And so people started to, rise up and come to all of these organized protests and meetings and join with the guerrilla groups and revolutionaries. So this was truly a ground-up movement, right, if I've ever seen one. And so here we have even more, more folks from the ground up, right, joining the forces, trying to, get in on the action. We have more protests, right, kind of going up and up and up, getting more widespread over time. We even have plenty of the wives and daughters of the revolutionaries join in, right, giving them guns and weapons when traditionally it is not seen as a very machismo thing to do, right, to give the women weapons. And so they started to train them how to fight in guerrilla warfare status. Notice that all the women are also having bandoliers as well in a very Zapata manner. So truly, this revolution was from the ground up. It was encompassing championing of the agrarian people, men and women, right? It was truly a wonderful sight to behold, right, and to study as a historian. Even today in the modern age, people still remember Zapata, and especially in a few other areas of Mexico, he is still regarded as like a local folk hero, right? Sort of like I don't know if the analogy would be correct entirely, but like the Robin Hood of the people, right? Like fighting for the people. And, even artwork today, right? Some of the artwork today still remembers him and, what they fought for. There is a recent artwork that I debated putting on here for the sake of the lecture and the slides, but I decided against it because it's a little bit risque. Because and this was from the last year or so, but an artist painted a naked portrait of Emiliano Zapata and put him like next to a horse. But he's just kind of gloriously just like doing his thing. And so that's caused a huge amount of criticism from the side where, they were like worshiping him and saying he's like a wonderful icon and a manly icon of revolution and for the people. And so they completely do not like the fact that he was being just like naked and kind of very artsy. And the other side is, well, it's art, right? And so we liked the entire revolution and what he stood for as well. But this is our way of kind of remembering him. So that was pretty interesting. I did debate on putting the actual like image here, but just in case, for the sake of, if you really want to, you can go on Google Images and go on any news stories and find it probably. And so what were some lasting legacies of Zapata and kind of the governments that were going to follow, right, leading up to World War II? Although Zapata was eventually assassinated, his agrarian reforms, his agricultural reforms, were enacted eventually, right? And they were pretty impossible to reverse because the ball had already started rolling, right? He brought the momentum from the people. And so the central government started to come to terms with the fact that they can't change anything and they have to go along with these reforms. So Zapata was fighting very hard for all of these reforms and eventually succeeded, albeit he did not live to see his success. And so his image and name were still even invoked even up to the 1990s, right? With the Zapatista Army of National Liberation. There's still various people that look upon him as that, wonderful historical figure and a champion of the people. And after his death, for the next couple of decades, his death did actually have this snowball effect that we can actually see realistically in the governmental change within Mexico. So with Alvaro Obregón, he oversaw the offices from 20 to 24 until his assassination a few years after that. But he was flirting with Marxist ideas and was talking with the USSR very heavily, right? Debating about capitalism versus communism for nation building, and also quoting and citing Emiliano Zapata and his agrarian reforms. And so the agrarian reforms at the very heart of it, right? It is meant to give more reforms and more rights and more leeway and more money and freedoms towards the people at the quote-unquote bottom of the socio-economic hierarchy. The farmers, the agrarian workers. And so, if that is your main goal, reading about Marxist ideology and communism is not too far off, right? Because it is similar in certain aspects of redistributing wealth, right, throughout the population. And so, he was conversing with the USSR, with some theorists at that time, and possibly maybe the United States assassinated him because they did not want Mexico to turn into this huge communistic center, right next to them on the border. But at least we could see the change of a president of Mexico was making a change and thinking of the people. Right after that, from 34 to 40, we have Lázaro Cárdenas. He was revitalizing a lot of these revolutionary ideas, fighting for peasant rights, sponsoring reforms, and mobilizing the military to help build a lot of public work projects. Taking Mexico from its feudalistic kind of hacienda economy as a old precursor of, kind of having its vestiges from the old Spanish model of European, economics, and dragging them into a modern industrial one. But Mr. Cárdenas, he definitely kept citing Emiliano Zapata and having, clearly on his platform, right, fighting for peasant rights. That's not something most of the presidents back in the day wanted. Especially in Mexican history, a lot of the old Spaniards, right, and a lot of the old guard, as we were talking about, they wanted just the status quo. We have the elite, and you are the mestizos, and you guys are this, and this is how it's done. So the fact that we're actually seeing real sponsored change on the presidential level just goes to show how deep-rooted a lot of these revolutions were. Oh, this is a great segment. So if you have a few minutes of time, definitely watch this. This is the anti-Mexican racism in Los Angeles, and discussing the Zoot Suit riots. And so this gets into local Los Angeles history. This gets into some fashion statements that they were making, intermixed a little bit with World War II. And essentially it was local Mexican Americans getting into, fights with some excuse me, some American soldiers and sailors. And a lot of it was fueled by essentially just racism throughout Los Angeles. And so even those, they were like very small, isolated incidents that shouldn't have been anything. The Los Angeles newspapers, though, started to write in a very kind of yellow journalism type of way, saying gangs running amok, right? Mexicans just, are trying to, rule the streets, right? They're really just fear mongering. And so eventually we ended up getting like larger scale riots. So it's a fascinating little segment of history. So if you have the time, watch this video. I think you'd like it. So by 1945, the end of World War II, what was the impact of many Mexican Americans in southern U.S. and the Southwest? After years of revolution within Mexico, more than 1 million refugees fled to the border across into the United States. As always, just like all of our other lectures, there is always some type of catalyst that forces people to move from their home, which they find comfortable, into another country. In this case, it was political and military instability. And so the fact that all these individuals were coming into the United States, it did shift the socioeconomic and political layout of the United States because demographics were switching a little bit, right? And getting adjusted. The border states that they ended up finding themselves in, the majority of them were finding work in mines, farms, railroads, and all of these very large project structures because that's where most of the money was. If the government is giving contracts for rebuilding the bridges and making railroad extensions, right? They were paying very good money. Yeah, yes, it is very hard, back-breaking labor, but pays well. And especially when you find yourself in a new country and you have to provide for you and your family and your children, the pay is everything. And some of my final thoughts on all of this are, it's a very interesting situation that Mexican Americans found themselves in. We have the quote-unquote homegrown ones that kind of got just incorporated into the United States after the Mexican-American War quote-unquote closed, and a bunch of just treaties essentially said your entire homeland and your ranch and your businesses and the entire state has now switched from the Mexican government to the U.S. government. And you're just sitting there on your front porch saying, okay, great. Many of those individuals had an interesting experience transitioning to being Americans. But even when they were transitioning to being Americans, they still were not fully considered American. And we're going to talk about this a little bit more in our chapter 13, Latino Mosaic. What does it really mean to be American, right? And so, their contribution to the United States is obviously like not to be understated, right? It is a huge demographic of the United States. We've had videos in class that we have watched on these shifts of demographics, right? And I believe the one video I showed earlier in their semester is called the Browning of America, right? Because demographically by, I think it was 2050 or so, right? By the year 2050, something like that, the majority of the United States is no longer going to be white. It is going to be, is going to be Hispanic, is going to be African American, Asian, right? All of the other represented, folks. And so things are definitely, changing on the horizon. They're changing today. But, if we're talking about it in a historical standpoint, they definitely had to fight this type of, system, right? And the nation as a whole and socially, and kind of prove to them that, yes, we are also American. And so I've always thought of that as, very hypocritical of just the United States and the people who move here in general, right? Because all of these, let's say, white immigrants that are coming over from Europe, from Ireland, from Italy, and France, wherever, right? Eastern Europe, whoever. You come here as an immigrant yourself, and then once you get adjusted here after a few years of life, you're going to turn to somebody else and say, oh, what are you doing here, right? Go back to your country. It doesn't make sense to me, right? We are a land of immigrants. I am an immigrant myself, right? So I definitely understand, that kind of plight. Let's open this up to some modern conversation as well. And I wanted to put this in here just for a couple of different reasons. First reason is background ethnicity, race, religion, all of it always gets used for politics, right? For fear mongering, for politics to get votes. A lot of times in the news that we are going to be watching, regardless of whether it's CNN, Fox, anything in between. I've seen it on the left, I've seen it on the right. All of these issues a lot of times get used in order to garner more votes, right? Because at the end of the day, that's what the political parties want. They want power. They want to be, at the head. Not to say that these issues do not exist, but I do think the media kind of over-exaggerates at certain points in time. But we can see it very clearly even here from the Republican side. The very top video is George W. Bush. The man had many issues, right, and stumbles in his presidency, clearly, but he still spoke in a very presidential way, and he understood that Mexican Americans were a proud part of the community. In this video, right, he's giving a wonderful sort of thoughtful notice and prayer for Cinco de Mayo, for instance, and giving wonderful words and testaments to the Mexican American community. Fast forward, a couple of presidencies, and we have Donald Trump, who, keeps saying, build that wall. We have to get at one point he was calling them rapists. They were murderers coming across the border. And he just publicly getting away with it. So the rhetoric has changed immensely. The rhetoric has become far more politicized than it has been since, let's say, the George W. Bush era. And I just, it's something for us to obviously be conscientious of and aware of. And hopefully more Americans do not get sucked into the politics. Because politics does have a way of kind of replacing humanity at the end of the day. And that's a trend that I don't want to go down towards. This is a great TED Talk I found by Eric Gomez. This is a TED Talk about experiences of immigration, ethnic identity, language, being accepted as a quote-unquote American, whatever that means, and receiving disparaging comments about immigrants. He talks about Trump's 2016 campaign and analyzing a lot of Trump's rhetoric on immigrants and how it relates to the American dream, and discussing also what does it mean for America to be called, quote unquote, the greatest nation in the world, right? And so even with like happiness index scores, Mexico and other countries were scoring a bit higher than the United States. Like, what does that mean about the U.S. being quote unquote better, And how should we take all of this into consideration in regards to our rhetoric about immigration? So immigration is always kind of one of those large political topics, right, that people are going to discuss every few years. And so he gives a very interesting perspective and point on all of these issues. So I think it's worth it to watch if you have some time. And with that, we are done with chapter 11, folks. Thank you for being here. I really do appreciate it as always. Hopefully my lecture was fun, informative, and you learned a little bit something new. And so we do have some work coming up, so definitely make sure to be mindful of the dates. And yeah, I'll see you later for the next lecture. So see you around. Take care.